June 7, 1954. A cleaning lady enters a house in the quiet suburb of Wilmslow, Cheshire, England. She finds the body of a 41-year-old man lying in his bed, a half-eaten apple on the nightstand beside him. The apple is laced with cyanide. The man is Alan Turing, the mathematical genius who broke the Nazi Enigma code and shortened World War II by an estimated 2 to 4 years, saving countless millions of lives. He is also a convicted criminal, punished by the British government for being homosexual, subjected to chemical castration that destroyed his body and mind. This is the story of one of the 20th century's greatest intellects, a man who helped invent the computer, laid foundations for artificial intelligence, and contributed more to Allied victory than perhaps any other individual, only to be persecuted, broken, and driven to suicide by the country he saved. We're about to explore one of history's most brilliant minds and one of its most shameful betrayals. A mathematician who saw patterns where others saw chaos, who understood that machines could think before such an idea seemed possible, who approached problems with such original genius that his solutions seemed to come from another dimension. But we'll also witness how prejudice and fear can destroy even the greatest contributors to civilization, how a society can honor someone publicly while destroying them privately, how the same government that depended on Turing's genius to survive treated him as a criminal simply for being who he was. This is a journey through code breaking and computing, through mathematical brilliance and human cruelty, through wartime heroism and peacetime persecution. Let's explore how Alan Turing's mind worked, what he accomplished, and why his story ends with a poisoned apple beside his bed. Alan Matheson Turing was born on June 23, 1912, in Maida Vale, London, to Julius and Ethel Turing. His father was a member of the Indian Civil Service, which meant Alan and his older brother John spent much of their childhood separated from their parents who were stationed in India. The boys were placed with foster families and attended boarding schools in England, a common arrangement for children of colonial administrators, but one that created emotional distance and independence in young Alan. From his earliest years, Alan showed signs of extraordinary intelligence, but not always in ways his teachers appreciated. He was obsessed with understanding how things worked, taking apart toys and household objects to examine their mechanisms. He would become so absorbed in problems that he ignored everything else, including basic social niceties. His teachers noted his brilliance, but also his messiness, his poor handwriting, his tendency to ignore subjects that didn't interest him while obsessing over those that did. At Sherborne School, a prestigious boarding school he attended from age 13, Alan struggled socially but excelled intellectually. He was bullied for being different, too intense, too focused on mathematics and science, uninterested in sports and the rough masculine culture of English boarding schools. But he found refuge in mathematics, where problems had definite solutions and logic reigned supreme. He taught himself advanced mathematics, working through problems that university students would find challenging. A pivotal relationship formed at Sherborne when Alan became friends with Christopher Morcom, a fellow student who shared his passion for science and mathematics. Christopher was everything Alan wanted to be: brilliant, athletic, confident, popular. The friendship was intense and formative for Alan, who later acknowledged it might have been his first love, though whether Christopher felt the same way is unknown. They planned to study mathematics together at Cambridge University, pushing each other intellectually and dreaming of scientific breakthroughs they would make together. In February 1930, Christopher Morcom died suddenly from complications of bovine tuberculosis. He was 18 years old. Alan was devastated, experiencing grief so profound it shaped the rest of his life. He threw himself into mathematics with even greater intensity, as though solving problems could fill the void Christopher's death created. He began questioning the nature of mind and consciousness. If Christopher's brilliant mind was gone, what did that mean about the relationship between thought and physical matter? These philosophical questions would later manifest in his groundbreaking work on artificial intelligence. If you're fascinated by stories of genius, tragedy, and the intersection of mathematics and humanity, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you detailed explorations of history's most remarkable and complicated figures, examining not just what they accomplished, but who they were as human beings. Alan entered King's College, Cambridge in 1931 to study mathematics. Cambridge in the 1930s was one of the world's great intellectual centres, attracting brilliant minds from across the globe. The mathematics department was particularly distinguished, home to some of the century's greatest mathematicians. Alan thrived in this environment, finding peers who could appreciate and challenge his thinking. At Cambridge, Alan could also begin exploring his sexuality more openly, at least within certain circles. Homosexuality was illegal in Britain, carrying severe penalties, but Cambridge had a more tolerant atmosphere than most of British society. King's College in particular had a reputation for accepting homosexual students and faculty. Alan had relationships with men, though always discreetly, aware that discovery could mean criminal prosecution and social ruin. He earned his undergraduate degree with distinction and was elected a Fellow of King's College in 1935 at just 23 years old, a remarkable achievement indicating his mathematical prowess was already recognized by senior academics. His fellowship dissertation on probability theory demonstrated original thinking but impressed even the most demanding professors. Alan Turing was establishing himself as one of Britain's most promising young mathematicians, though his greatest achievements still lay ahead. In 1936, while still in his early 20s, Alan Turing published a paper that would revolutionize mathematics and lay the theoretical foundation for all modern computing. On computable numbers, with an application to the Entscheidungs problem, addressed a fundamental question in mathematics. Could there be an automatic method for determining whether any mathematical statement was provable? The German mathematician David Hilbert had posed this question, called the Entscheidungs problem, decision problem, as one of the major unsolved problems in mathematics. Turing's answer was no, there could be no such universal method. But far more important than his negative answer was how he arrived at it. To prove his result, Turing invented an imaginary machine that could perform any calculation that any human mathematician could perform, given enough time and paper. This theoretical device, now called a Turing machine, consisted of an infinitely long tape divided into squares, a head that could read and write symbols on the tape, and a set of rules determining what the head should do based on what it read. The Turing machine was brilliantly simple yet extraordinarily powerful. Turing demonstrated that this basic machine could compute anything that was computable by any means whatsoever. It established the theoretical limits of computation. Anything a Turing machine couldn't compute, no machine could compute. This concept of Turing completeness remains fundamental to computer science today. But Turing went further. He described a universal Turing machine, a single machine, that could simulate any other Turing machine by reading its program from the tape. This was the theoretical concept underlying all general-purpose computers, a single device that could perform any computational task simply by being programmed differently. Before Turing, machines were built for specific purposes. Turing envisioned a universal machine that could be programmed to do anything. This paper, published when Turing was just 24, essentially invented computer science as a field. It established the theoretical foundations that would guide the development of actual electronic computers a decade later. Yet, in 1936, few people understood its significance. Turing was working in pure mathematics, answering abstract questions about the nature of computation. The practical applications wouldn't become apparent until the pressures of war demanded machines that could perform calculations faster than any human. After completing this groundbreaking work, Turing traveled to Princeton University in the United States to pursue graduate studies. At Princeton from 1936 to 1938, he worked under Alonzo Church, another pioneering figure in theoretical computer science who had independently arrived at similar conclusions about computation. Turing earned his PhD and was offered positions to stay in America, but he chose to return to Britain. War was coming and he wanted to be home. Nazi Germany's military communications relied on a machine called Enigma, an electromechanical device that encrypted messages with such complexity that German commanders believed it was unbreakable. The mathematics behind Enigma were indeed formidable. The machine had 3, later 4, rotors that could be arranged in different orders, and each rotor had 26 positions. Additional board settings added more complexity. The total number of possible Enigma settings exceeded 150 trillion. German military operators would set their Enigma machines to a specific daily key rotor positions and plug board settings detailed in codebooks distributed to units. They would type their plain text message and the machine would output encrypted text, which was then transmitted by radio. The receiving operator, with their Enigma set to the same key, would type the encrypted message and get back the original plain text. To anyone intercepting the transmission without knowing the daily key, the message appeared as random gibberish. The British had captured Enigma machines and knew how they worked, but this didn't help much. Without knowing each day's key settings, the number of possibilities was so vast that testing them all was impossible. The Germans changed keys daily, sometimes more frequently for important communications. Even if you could somehow test every possible setting, you would need to do so in less than 24 hours, then start over the next day with new keys. Polish mathematicians had made significant progress on Enigma before the war, developing mechanical devices called bombs that could test settings automatically. But when Germany added more rotors and complexity to Enigma, the Polish methods became inadequate. As war approached, Polish intelligence shared their work with Britain and France. The British Government Code and Cipher School, located at Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion about 50 miles north of London, took on the challenge of breaking Enigma. In September 1939, as Britain entered World War II, Alan Turing arrived at Bletchley Park. The government had identified him as someone with the mathematical brilliance necessary for cryptographic work. Turing was recruited alongside other mathematicians, linguists, chess masters, and crossword puzzle champions, people whose minds could see patterns and solve problems that defeated conventional thinking. Bletchley Park would become home to thousands of people working in shifts around the clock, intercepting and analyzing German communications. But in 1939 it was still relatively small, and Enigma remained unbroken. If Britain couldn't read German military communications, the war would be immeasurably harder, perhaps impossible to win. U-boats in the Atlantic were sinking merchant ships carrying vital supplies to Britain. German military coordination was devastatingly effective. Breaking Enigma became one of the war's most critical objectives. Alan Turing approached Enigma with characteristic brilliance and originality. Rather than trying to test every possible setting through brute force, he looked for weaknesses in how the Germans used the machine. He understood that perfect encryption systems exist in theory, but real-world systems fail through human error and predictable patterns. German operators, despite training, made mistakes. They would sometimes use predictable phrases in messages where the reports often began with wetter, weather. Military communications might include kein Besonderen Ergernis, nothing to report. These cribs, known or guessed plain text that appeared in encrypted messages, gave Turing the foothold he needed. If you knew a word appeared somewhere in an encrypted message, you could test whether specific Enigma settings would produce that encryption. But even with cribs, the number of settings to test was impossibly large for humans. Turing needed a machine that could test settings automatically and rapidly. Building on Polish work, Turing designed an improved electromechanical device he called the bomb, named after the Polish bomber. The bombe was not a computer in the modern sense, but rather a specialized machine designed for one purpose, testing Enigma settings. It consisted of multiple sets of rotating drums wired to simulate Enigma rotors. When activated, the bombe would test settings rapidly, eliminating those that couldn't possibly produce the known crib, narrowing down possibilities until finding settings that might be correct. The first Turing bombe became operational in March 1940. It was enormous, about 7 feet tall, 7 feet wide and 2 feet deep, and made a distinctive clicking sound as its drums rotated. The name bomb might have come from the Polish term, or possibly from the ticking sound it made, like a bomb waiting to explode with information. Please take a moment to like this video and share it if you're finding this exploration of Alan Turing's genius compelling. Your engagement helps us continue creating these detailed historical narratives about the people who shaped our world. But breaking Enigma wasn't just a matter of building the right machine. It required understanding German operating procedures, recognizing patterns, exploiting mistakes, and constantly adapting as the Germans changed their protocols. Turing worked alongside a team that included Gordon Welchman, who improved the bomb's design, and Joan Clark, a brilliant mathematician who became one of Turing's closest colleagues and briefly his fiancée. The intellectual challenge was enormous. Every day brought new encrypted messages. Every day the keys changed. The bombs could narrow down possibilities, but human analysts still needed to examine the results, test likely settings, and confirm when they had broken that day's key. And they had to do all of this quickly. Intercepted messages lost value rapidly as military situations changed. By late 1940, Bletchley Park was regularly breaking Enigma keys for various German military services. The intelligence derived from these decryptions, codenamed Ultra, began flowing to British commanders. The impact on the war was immediate and profound, though necessarily kept secret. No commander could act on Ultra intelligence in a way that would reveal to Germans that Enigma was broken. Such revelation would cause Germany to abandon Enigma, shutting down this vital intelligence source. Perhaps nowhere was Enigma intelligence more crucial than in the Battle of the Atlantic. The prolonged struggle between German U-boats and Allied shipping. Britain depended on supplies from North America: food, fuel, weapons, raw materials. German submarines hunted Allied merchant convoys, sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. If the U-boats won, Britain would starve and be forced out of the war. German naval Enigma was particularly difficult to break. The Kriegsmarine used a more complex version with additional rotors and more sophisticated procedures. For much of 1941, naval Enigma remained unbroken, and U-boats operated with devastating effectiveness. Merchant ships sank by the hundreds. Sailors died in the cold Atlantic waters. Britain's survival was in question. Alan Turing personally took on the challenge of naval Enigma. He worked obsessively, sleeping little, surviving on minimal food, thinking constantly about the problem. Colleagues remembered him as disheveled and eccentric, occasionally chaining his coffee mug to a radiator to prevent theft, riding his bicycle with a gas mask during pollen season to control his allergies, wearing a pajama top under his jacket because it was warmer than a shirt. The breakthrough came through a combination of Turing's mathematical insight, captured Enigma materials from German vessels, and recognition of patterns in how German naval operators used their machines. By mid-1941, Bletchley Park was reading some naval Enigma traffic. By 1942, the decryption was becoming routine. Allied commanders could now route convoys around U-boat positions, direct anti-submarine forces to where submarines were operating, and generally outmaneuver the German submarine campaign. The impact was measurable in lives and tons of shipping. Convoy losses decreased significantly once naval Enigma was being read regularly. Ships that would have been sunk reached Britain safely. Supplies got through. Britain could continue fighting. The U-boat threat, while never eliminated, was contained. Some historians estimate that breaking naval Enigma shortened the war by 2 years or more, meaning Alan Turing's work potentially saved millions of lives. But Turing and his colleagues could never speak of this achievement. The Official Secrets Act bound them to silence about their Bletchley Park work. After the war, the bombs were destroyed and the work classified. For decades, the critical role of ultra-intelligence remained secret. The public credited Britain's survival to the courage of sailors and the skill of military commanders, which was certainly true, but didn't know about the crucial advantage that Enigma decrypts provided. While Enigma was Bletchley Park's most famous challenge, it wasn't the only one. German High Command communications used an even more sophisticated encryption system called the Lorenz cipher, which the British codenamed Tony. Unlike Enigma, which was used for tactical military communications, Lorenz encrypted strategic communications between Hitler and his top commanders. Breaking Lorenz required even more computational power than Enigma. The Bletchley Park mathematician Bill Tutt performed the astonishing feat of reverse engineering the Lorenz machine's internal logic from encrypted messages alone. He figured out how the machine worked without ever seeing one, purely through statistical analysis of the output. It was an intellectual achievement perhaps even more remarkable than Turing's work on Enigma. But breaking Lorenz required processing power beyond what electromechanical bombs could provide. Tommy Flowers, an engineer at the Post Office Research Station, proposed building an electronic computer using vacuum tubes to perform the necessary calculations. The machine, called Colossus, became operational in December 1943. It was one of the world's first electronic programmable computers, predating ENIAC, often incorrectly credited as the first by several years. Alan Turing was not the primary designer of Colossus. That credit belongs to Tommy Flowers and his team. But Turing's theoretical work on computation and his practical experience building the bombs influenced its development. More importantly, Turing understood immediately that Colossus represented something new, a machine that could be programmed to perform different calculations, not just a single-purpose device. It was a real-world implementation of ideas similar to his universal Turing machine. Colossus and its successors processed Lorenz encrypted messages, giving British intelligence access to Hitler's most secret communications. This intelligence proved particularly valuable in the lead-up to D-Day, when ultra-intercepts revealed where Germans expected the Allied invasion and how they planned to respond. The deception campaign, convincing Germans the invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy, was confirmed as successful through Lorenz decrypts. Watching Colossus operate, Turing could see the future. Electronic computers could perform calculations at speeds impossible for humans or mechanical devices. They could be programmed to solve different problems by changing their instructions rather than their physical structure. The theoretical machines he had imagined in 1936 were becoming real. After the war, Turing would dedicate himself to developing this technology further, to building machines that could think. With the war over, Alan Turing turned his attention to a question that had fascinated him since Christopher Morcom's death. Could machines think? In 1945, he joined the National Physical Laboratory (NPL) to design an electronic computer. His design, called the Automatic Computing Engine (ACACE), was remarkably advanced for its time, incorporating ideas about stored programs and processing that wouldn't become standard for years. But Turing struggled with the bureaucracy and slow pace at NPL. His design was simplified and delayed by engineers who didn't understand or trust his vision. Frustrated, Turing left NPL in 1948 to join the Computing Machine Laboratory at the University of Manchester, where a small electronic computer called the Manchester Baby had just run its first program. Turing would help develop this into a more capable machine while pursuing his theoretical interests in artificial intelligence. In 1950, Turing published one of computing's most influential papers, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. The paper opened with a direct question: can machines think? Rather than getting bogged down in philosophical debates about consciousness and thought, Turing proposed a practical test. The Turing test, as it became known, involved a human interrogator communicating via text with two subjects, one human, one machine. If the interrogator couldn't reliably determine which was which, then the machine could be said to exhibit intelligent behavior equivalent to a human's. Turing wasn't claiming the machine would be conscious or truly thinking in some philosophical sense. He was proposing that functional equivalence in behavior was sufficient to call something intelligent. This was revolutionary thinking in 1950. Most people viewed computers as glorified calculators, incapable of creativity or understanding. The idea that machines might one day engage in intelligent conversation, write poetry, or play chess at expert levels seemed like science fiction. But Turing saw that these were all computational processes, and if something was computable, a sufficiently advanced computer could do it. The paper anticipated objections that would be raised for decades. Could machines have consciousness? Turing argued this was unprovable even for other humans. We assume other people are conscious, but can't actually know. Could machines be creative? Turing pointed out that human creativity might itself be a computational process, following rules we don't fully understand. Could machines have emotions? Perhaps emotional behavior was also programmable. Turing's vision extended beyond just answering questions. He imagined machines that could learn, that could improve their performance through experience, that could be taught like children rather than explicitly programmed. He envisioned neural networks and machine learning decades before such technologies became practical. Reading his 1950 paper today is eerie, is describing things that are only now becoming reality. Technologies that are transforming society 70 years after he imagined them. Before we continue with Turing's personal struggles and tragic end, please consider subscribing to our channel. These detailed explorations help us understand not just the history of technology, but the human stories behind world-changing innovations. But even as Turing was thinking decades ahead of his time, his personal life was about to collide with the prejudices of his era in catastrophic ways. In December 1951, Alan Turing met Arnold Murray, a 19-year-old unemployed man, outside a movie theatre in Manchester. They began a relationship, with Murray occasionally staying at Turing's house. The relationship was romantic and sexual, though Murray also seemed interested in Turing's money and what he could get from him. In January 1952, Turing's house was burgled. Small items were stolen, and Turing suspected Murray's involvement, or at least that Murray knew the burglar. When Turing reported the burglary to police, the investigation uncovered his relationship with Murray. In the course of questioning, both Turing and Murray admitted to homosexual acts. In 1950s Britain, homosexuality was illegal under the Labouchere Amendment of 1885, which criminalized gross indecency between men. Conviction could result in imprisonment, social ruin, and inclusion on a sex offenders register. The law reflected Victorian morality that viewed homosexuality as a disease, a moral failing, or a criminal perversion. That thousands of men were living in fear, hiding fundamental aspects of their identity, was considered necessary for maintaining public morality. Alan Turing was arrested and charged with gross indecency. He made no attempt to hide or deny his homosexuality. He seemed genuinely puzzled that his private consensual relationship with another adult was considered a crime. He had broken German military codes that experts thought unbreakable, had helped save his country from defeat, had laid foundations for the computer age, and now he was a criminal because he loved men instead of women. The trial in March 1952 was a formality. Turing pled guilty, perhaps believing honesty was the best approach, perhaps simply tired of hiding. He was convicted. The judge offered him a choice: imprisonment or probation, with mandatory chemical treatment designed to eliminate his sexual urges. The treatment involved injections of synthetic estrogen, essentially chemical castration. Turing chose the hormonal treatment over prison, perhaps believing he could endure it while continuing his work. He had no idea what it would do to him. The estrogen injections began, and their effects were devastating. Turing developed breasts as the female hormone altered his body. He suffered mood swings, depression, and loss of energy. The brilliant mathematician who had worked with such intensity found his concentration impaired, his mental clarity compromised. His body was being chemically altered to eliminate urges the state found unacceptable. Friends who saw him during this period were horrified. The treatment was brutal, primitive, based on the idea that homosexuality was a disease that could be cured through hormonal manipulation. Modern medicine recognizes this as barbaric, but in 1952 it was considered enlightened after all. Turing was being treated rather than imprisoned. Turing's conviction created another problem: his security clearance. His work at Bletchley Park remained classified, and he continued consulting on government cryptographic projects. But a conviction for homosexuality meant he was now considered a security risk. The logic, such as it was, went like this: homosexuals were breaking the law and therefore had to hide their activities. This made them vulnerable to blackmail. Foreign intelligence services, particularly the Soviet KGB, could threaten to expose their sexuality unless they provided classified information. Therefore, homosexuals couldn't be trusted with secrets regardless of their loyalty or past service. This reasoning was circular and cruel. The law criminalized homosexuality, creating the blackmail vulnerability, then used that vulnerability to justify discrimination. If homosexuality had been legal, there would be nothing to blackmail about. But the security establishment couldn't or wouldn't see this logic. Homosexuals were security risks. End of discussion. Turing's security clearance was revoked. He was barred from continuing his cryptographic consultancy work. The man who had broken Enigma, who had saved Britain during its darkest hour, was now treated as a potential traitor. The irony was savage. Turing's wartime work remained so secret that few people knew about it, so he couldn't even point to his service as evidence of loyalty. He was being punished for who he loved, and the service that should have protected him remained classified. The revocation of security clearance also meant Turing couldn't travel to the United States, where much of the cutting-edge computer research was occurring. American authorities had similar policies about homosexuality and security, and Turing's conviction made him inadmissible. His ability to participate in the international scientific community was being restricted just as that community was beginning to explore ideas he had pioneered. Friends and colleagues were concerned but helpless. The Official Secrets Act prevented them from publicly discussing Turing's wartime contributions, which might have created sympathy and protection. His conviction was a matter of public record, but his service to his country remained secret. The government he had saved was destroying him, and almost nobody knew enough to protest. Despite the hormonal treatment, the criminal conviction, and the loss of security clearance, Alan Turing continued working. In 1952, he published The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis, a paper that founded the field of mathematical biology. The work explored how complex patterns in nature, the spots on a leopard, the stripes on a zebra, the spiral arrangement of sunflower seeds could emerge from simple chemical processes following mathematical rules. Turing proposed that morphogenesis, the development of form and pattern in living organisms, could be explained by reaction-diffusion equations. Two chemicals diffusing through tissue and reacting with each other in specific ways could create stable patterns. The mathematics predicted various patterns that matched what appeared in nature: stripes, spots, spirals, and other formations. This was typically Turing taking a problem from a completely different field than his previous work, applying mathematical rigor and deriving insights that opened new areas of research. The morphogenesis work wouldn't be fully appreciated for decades, but it eventually influenced developmental biology, pattern formation theory, and understanding of how complexity emerges from simple rules. That Turing was producing such innovative work while enduring chemical castration is remarkable. His mind remained brilliant even as his body and emotions were being ravaged by the estrogen treatment. He continued his work on artificial intelligence, wrote programs for the Manchester computer, and explored theoretical questions about computation and intelligence. But there were signs of decline. Colleagues noticed he seemed depressed, that the spark of enthusiasm that had characterized him was dimming. The hormonal treatment was supposed to last a year, and by 1953 it had ended, but the psychological damage remained. Turing had been convicted of a crime for being who he was. His body had been chemically altered against his nature. His security clearance was gone. His ability to travel was restricted. The future that had seemed so bright, computers that could think, machines that could learn, a new age of information, was still there. But Turing's role in building it was being constrained by bigotry and fear. 1953 and early 1954 were difficult for Alan Turing. The hormonal treatment had officially ended, but its effects lingered. He struggled with depression, though he tried to maintain his research and his connections with friends and colleagues. He travelled when he could, visiting Norway where homosexuality was legal, and he could be himself without fear. He maintained his friendship with Joan Clark, his former colleague from Bletchley Park, and briefly his fiancée before he explained he was homosexual, and they amicably broke the engagement. Turing's mother Ethel lived nearby, and their relationship was complicated. She loved her son but didn't understand him, particularly his homosexuality. Turing couldn't be fully honest with her about his life or his struggles. Like so many gay men of his era, he lived a double life, outwardly conventional, inwardly tormented by having to hide fundamental aspects of his identity. Friends who saw Turing during this period noticed he seemed to be withdrawing. The playful eccentricity that had characterized him, the chained coffee mug, the bicycle with the faulty chain he could predict when it would slip, the childlike enthusiasm for problems was fading. Depression was settling in, a grey fog that dimmed even his brilliant mind. In early June 1954, Turing seemed to be in better spirits. He was working on various problems, corresponding with colleagues, planning future research. There were no obvious warning signs that anything was desperately wrong, but depression doesn't always announce itself clearly, and Turing had years of practice hiding his true feelings. On June 7, 1954, Turing didn't respond when his cleaning lady, Eliza Clayton, knocked on his door. She entered using her key and found him in bed, apparently asleep. But he wasn't breathing. On the nightstand beside his bed was an apple, partially eaten. The apple had been dipped in cyanide solution. Alan Turing was dead at age 41. The inquest into Turing's death concluded it was suicide. The evidence seemed clear: cyanide poisoning, apparent depression, history of hormonal treatment, and criminal conviction. The coroner ruled death by suicide while the balance of his mind was disturbed. The apple, though never tested for cyanide, was assumed to be the delivery method. Turing had eaten the poisoned apple and died, but the case has peculiarities that have led some to question the suicide verdict. Turing had been setting up apparatus for electrolysis experiments involving cyanide solution for gold plating. It's possible the death was accidental. He could have contaminated the apple inadvertently while eating during experiments. Turing was notoriously careless about safety in his home laboratory. Others have suggested even darker possibilities: murder disguised as suicide. Turing still knew secrets about Bletchley Park. He had been to Norway, a NATO member, but bordering the Soviet Union, in the paranoid atmosphere of the early Cold War, with security services obsessed about homosexual security risks. Could someone have decided Turing knew too much and was too vulnerable? There's no evidence for this theory, but the circumstances of his death left room for speculation. The apple itself is suggestive symbolism, perhaps deliberately so. Turing was fascinated by the Disney film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and often quoted the witch's chant as she prepared the poisoned apple. Dip the apple in the brew, let the sleeping death seep through. Whether Turing deliberately chose this method as symbolic, or whether the symbolism is coincidental, has been debated. Please take a moment to like this video, and share it if you're finding this examination of Alan Turing's life and tragic death compelling. Your engagement helps us continue creating these detailed explorations of history's most important and tragic figures. His mother Ethel believed the death was accidental, and maintained this belief until her own death. She couldn't or wouldn't accept that her son had killed himself. Perhaps this was denial, or perhaps she knew something about his state of mind that suggested he wasn't suicidal. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that Alan Turing died young, his potential unfulfilled. His genius cut short, whether by his own hand, by accident, or by something more sinister. His death was a direct consequence of how British society treated homosexuals. If he had lived in a society that didn't criminalize his sexuality, that didn't subject him to chemical castration, that didn't treat him as a security risk and criminal for being who he was, would he have died at 41? Almost certainly not. After Turing's death, his work was scattered and hidden. His mother burned many of his papers, either unable to understand their significance, or perhaps trying to protect her son's reputation by destroying anything that might reveal his homosexuality. The government seized materials related to his classified work. Much of his legacy was literally destroyed or locked away. The wartime contributions remained classified for decades. The bombs were destroyed. Colossus was dismantled. The people who had worked at Bletchley Park were bound by the Official Secrets Act to never speak of what they had done. Turing's crucial role in breaking Enigma, his contribution to winning the war, his life-saving work, all of it remained secret. The public knew him, if at all, as a mathematician who had done some work on computers. This meant that for years, Turing's legacy was incomplete. His 1936 paper on computable numbers was recognized by computer scientists as foundational work, but most people didn't know about it. His morphogenesis paper slowly gained recognition in mathematical biology, but it wasn't widely understood. His ideas about artificial intelligence influenced early AI researchers, but the general public wasn't aware of his role. The man who helped create the modern world remained obscure. Meanwhile, computer science advanced rapidly. The machines Turing had imagined and helped create became ubiquitous. By the 1960s and 70s, computers were transforming business, science, and eventually everyday life. The questions Turing had asked about artificial intelligence — can machines think? Can they learn? Can they be creative? — were being explored by new generations of researchers, but they often didn't know they were standing on foundations. Turing